Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating chapters of history, the full story of the Viking Age. From legendary raids to far-off voyages, and from Norse mythology to the rise and fall of Viking kingdoms, this is a journey through time you won't want to miss. Before you get comfy and drift off to the sounds of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The World Before the Vikings. Before the first Viking sail ever pierced the northern fog, and long before Norsemen etched their runes into stone and history, Europe was already a land of shifting power, fading empires, and quiet transformation. To understand the Viking Age, we must first drift back into the centuries that preceded it, a time when the known world was changing, slowly, like the steady roll of the tide. It is the 5th century. The Western Roman Empire, once the unshakable force across much of Europe, has collapsed. Its legions have withdrawn, its cities crumbled or abandoned, and its order replaced by a mosaic of tribal kingdoms and fledgling states. In the vacuum left behind, the foundations of medieval Europe begin to form, foundations upon which the Vikings will later build, raid, and reshape. To the south and west, the lands of former Roman Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia are now controlled by groups like the Franks, the Visigoths, and the Anglo-Saxons. Christianity spreads with growing influence, carried by monks, bishops, and kings, eager to unite their people under a single faith. But far to the north, beyond the forests of Germania and across the cold Baltic, a different world endures. A rugged, forested, mountainous land where winters are long and the sea is both a barrier and a lifeline. This is Scandinavia, not yet unified, not yet feared, and not yet known to most outside its coasts. For now, it is a quiet place, quiet but not empty. In this era, life in what would become Norway, Sweden, and Denmark is harsh, simple, and deeply tied to the rhythms of nature. Small settlements are scattered across fertile valleys and rugged coastlines. These are not cities but farms, family compounds, and timber halls where communities huddle together for warmth, survival, and story. The people are primarily agrarian, farmers who till the soil, raise sheep, goats and cattle, and live off what they can grow or trade. But they are also hunters, fishers, and trappers. The forests offer game, the sea its bounty. In many ways, this is a self-sufficient world. Local chieftains govern their kin, and disputes are settled at gatherings called things, early versions of the assemblies that would later play a central role in Norse governance. Trade is not absent. Far from it. Even before the Viking Age, Scandinavian goods, furs, walrus ivory, amber, and iron were making their way to continental Europe, exchanged for silver, wine, and glass. And in return, ideas came north, of kings and empires, of writing and religion. Though isolated, the Norse were not disconnected. They watched the world, and they learned. They also dreamed. Across this early Scandinavian world, myths and legends filled the long nights. These tales were not yet written down, but passed from elder to child, repeated in the flickering light of the hearth. They spoke of gods and giants, of worlds born from fire and ice, and of a great tree Yggdrasil, that held all creation in its branches. In this cosmos, Odin wandered in search of wisdom. Thor battled the forces of chaos, and fate was woven by the Norns. These myths were not merely stories. They were a worldview, a way to make sense of a harsh and unpredictable life. They taught values, courage, loyalty, honor, cunning. They explained the cycles of nature, the mystery of death, and the hope of something beyond. And as time passed, these beliefs became cultural bedrock. They shaped the Norse people, preparing them for an age that would demand all the resilience, bravery, and ambition they could muster. Yet even as this world endured in relative peace, change loomed on the horizon. By the 6th century, the Scandinavian population was growing. Agricultural advances meant more food, and more food meant more people. But arable land was limited. Ambitious young men, eager for wealth and fame, found few opportunities at home. And to the south and west, news drifted in, news of rich monasteries, weak kingdoms, and the treasures of Christian Europe. It would not be long before someone decided to test the waters, and when they did, the Viking Age would begin. Not with an empire's declaration, but with the whisper of oars on dark water. Chapter 2: Scandinavian Society and Myth before the Viking Age. As we gently move forward in time, the societies of early Scandinavia begin to crystallize into something more recognizable, something uniquely Norse. These were not yet kingdoms, but they were cultures rich in tradition, bound by kinship, and deeply rooted in both land and legend. Scandinavia, at this point, remained a collection of loosely connected tribes and clans. There was no Norway, Sweden, or Denmark as we know them today. Instead, the land was divided among local chieftains, each ruling over their own community. These leaders were not monarchs, but they held authority through a mixture of lineage, wealth, martial strength, and personal charisma. Leadership was as much about loyalty as it was about blood. In each region, society was shaped by its geography. Along the jagged coastlines of what would become Norway, communities hugged the fjords, living from the sea and building sturdy homes from timber. In what would later be Denmark, flat lands supported agriculture, while the islands provided a maritime culture all their own. In the deep forests and lakes of Sweden, inland trade and trapping formed the basis of life. Despite the differences, certain cultural threads ran through all these societies. At the core was the household, called the longhouse. These were large wooden structures, typically rectangular, with a central hearth and a roof thatched with turf or reeds. Multiple generations of a family lived together under one roof, along with their servants, thralls, and animals. Life was communal, and the bonds of kinship were everything. To be without a family, or to be cast out, was one of the greatest misfortunes. Honor played a central role in everyday life. It governed how one acted, how disputes were handled, and how others viewed a person. An insult could not go unanswered, and a slighted man was expected to seek redress, either through compensation or revenge. This emphasis on personal honor would later fuel much of the conflict in Viking sagas. But before the sword, there was the spoken word. The Norse were master storytellers. In an age before widespread writing, Oral tradition was the lifeblood of history and identity. Skalds, poets and storytellers composed and performed elaborate verses, weaving together the deeds of gods and men. These skaldic poems were rich with kennings, metaphorical expressions that layered meaning like runes carved into stone. Through their stories, the Norse remembered. They remembered their ancestors, their victories, their tragedies, and their faith. That faith, the Old Norse religion, was not a static doctrine, but a living, breathing set of beliefs that evolved over time. At its heart was a vast pantheon, a mythological world that explained creation, nature, morality, and fate. Odin, the All-Father, sat at the center. He was a god of wisdom, war, death, and poetry. He gave one of his eyes to drink from the well of knowledge and hung himself from the world tree for 9 nights to gain the secrets of the runes. He was revered by rulers and poets alike. Thor, his son, was the most beloved among the common folk. With his hammer Mjolnir, he protected both gods and humans from the giants who sought to unravel the world. His thunderous strength was matched by his loyalty and courage. Then there was Freyja, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, who rode a chariot drawn by cats and wept tears of gold. She received half of the slain warriors in her hall, Sessrumnir, while the other half went to Odin's Valhalla. Loki, the trickster god, defied easy categorization. Sometimes friend, often foe, he embodied chaos and change, a necessary force in a world that constantly balanced between order and destruction. The Norse cosmology was both grand and grim. The universe was envisioned as a great tree, Yggdrasil, with roots and branches spanning 9 worlds. In this cosmos, humans lived in Midgard, surrounded by giants in Jotunheim, elves in Alfheim, and the dead in Helheim. It was a cyclical universe, destined to end in Ragnarok, a twilight of the gods, when the world would be destroyed and reborn. But the Norse did not fear the end. Ragnarok was accepted as fate, part of the natural order. To live bravely, to face one's destiny with honor, was the ultimate virtue. The idea of Valhalla, an eternal hall of feasting for fallen warriors, offered not only comfort, but a goal. Death in battle was not to be avoided, but embraced. This belief system was not simply religion, it was culture. It informed law, art, family, and war. It was carved into stones, sung around hearths, and whispered on the wind. And though it would one day fade before the rise of Christianity, it left behind echoes that still shape how we remember the Norse. In this prelude to the Viking Age, we see the forming of a people, resilient, curious, bound to myth and kin. The storm had not yet broken, but the clouds were gathering. Soon, these storytellers and seafarers would rise from their homeland and step into legend. But first, they would need a reason to leave. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Norsemen, Geography, Climate, and Culture. To truly understand how the Viking Age emerged, we must first look closely at the world from which the Norsemen rose, a land of extremes, shaped by its geography and molded by its climate. These forces, often overlooked, were among the most powerful architects of Norse civilization. Scandinavia is a region of both beauty and hardship. Its landscapes are dramatic, Norway's jagged fjords cut deep into the coastline, carved by glaciers over countless millennia. Mountains rise steeply from the sea, cloaked in forests and capped with snow. In the east, Sweden stretches out with dense woods and countless lakes, while Denmark lies low and fertile, a series of islands and peninsulas surrounded by shallow waters. This geography created natural barriers between communities. Travel by land was often slow and difficult, especially in winter, but the sea, ever present and unpredictable, was a different story. To the Norse, the sea was not a boundary, but a highway. It was the thread that tied their scattered settlements together and connected them with the wider world. And so, it was on the sea that the Norse identity began to form. From an early age, Norse children learned to sail, row, and fish. The water was both a means of survival and a proving ground. Mastery of the sea meant access to trade, to communication, to power. Over time, this relationship with the ocean would become one of the defining traits of Viking culture. The climate, too, shaped the Norse character. Long, dark winters tested both spirit and survival. The growing season was short, and the soil in many areas was thin. To endure required careful planning, strong communities, and a willingness to adapt. These were not luxuries, they were necessities. Such an environment forged a people who were practical, resilient, and self-reliant. These were not idle farmers. They were builders, blacksmiths, weavers, and hunters. They understood the cycles of nature not through books, but through generations of lived experience. Cultural life was vibrant, though different from what might be found in more centralized or urban societies. In Norse communities, art and expression were often woven into the fabric of daily objects, carvings on wooden doors, ornate brooches and arm rings, intricate designs on sword hilts and drinking horns. These motifs were more than decoration. They were symbols, often linked to myth and identity. The Norse developed a distinct artistic style, flowing, interlaced patterns of animals and knots, which seemed to coil and writhe with life. These designs adorned everything from ship prows to burial stones, and would come to be recognized across the known world as uniquely Viking. Trade was also integral to Norse society. As early as the 6th century, Scandinavian traders were exchanging goods across the Baltic Sea, reaching into what is now Germany, Poland, and the Slavic lands. Amber from the Baltic, furs from the north, and iron tools made their way south, while silver, glass, silk, and wine came in return. These trade routes were not only economic, they were cultural. Through them, the Norse encountered new ideas, new technologies, and new belief systems. They learned of kings who ruled vast territories, of religions with holy books and priests, of empires where cities stretched for miles. At home, Norse society remained decentralized. Power lay in the hands of local chieftains, but these leaders were not all-powerful. They depended on the loyalty of their followers, and that loyalty could be earned or lost. Assemblies, or things, were held regularly, where free men could speak, settle disputes, and make decisions. It was not democracy in the modern sense, but it was participatory, and it gave the Norse a strong sense of shared governance. As these elements, geography, climate, trade, and social structure, combined over centuries, they created a people well suited to the age that was coming. The Norse were tough, mobile, and adaptable. They valued personal strength, but also community. They revered tradition, but they were not afraid to explore the unknown. And explore they would. By the late 700s, the pressures of population growth, competition among chieftains, and tales of wealthy monasteries and undefended coasts began to push restless young men to look outward. With their ships, their courage, and their gods, they would set sail, and in doing so, they would change the world. Chapter 4. The Spark of 793. The Raid on Lindisfarne and its shockwaves. Every great epoch has its beginning, a moment when history takes a sharp turn and the world begins to change. For the Viking Age, that moment came in the year 793. It was a year that would be remembered not only in chronicles and manuscripts, but in the frightened whispers of a shaken continent. The place was Lindisfarne, a small tidal island off the northeast coast of what is now England. It was home to a Christian monastery, one of the most important in the British Isles. Founded in the 7th century, Lindisfarne had grown into a spiritual and cultural centre. It was known for its illuminated manuscripts, for its pious monks, and for the peaceful solitude it offered on the edge of the known world. But on a summer day in June, that peace was shattered. From the sea they came, longships with dragon-headed prows slicing through the water, carrying men whose very appearance defied expectation. They were tall, clad in leather and chain, armed with axes, swords, and shields. They were not an army of conquest. They were raiders, driven by speed and surprise, seeking silver, gold, and whatever else could be taken. The attack on Lindisfarne was swift and merciless. The monks, unarmed and unprepared, stood little chance. Some were killed where they knelt. Others were dragged away, their fates unknown. The church was ransacked, its treasures seized. Holy relics were defiled, and the sacred scrolls, handwritten over decades, were trampled and tossed aside. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the horror in somber tones. In this year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. The entry continued, describing how the ravaging of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne, with plundering and slaughter. Though some of these omens, like dragons in the sky, were likely symbolic, they reflected the scale of shock that swept through Christian Europe. This was not simply a robbery, it was a sacrilege. For many, it felt like the end of the world. But to the Norse, it was something else entirely. Lindisfarne was not the first place to be raided. There had been smaller incursions before, in Ireland, in Francia, but Lindisfarne was the first to be widely documented and deeply felt across Europe. It marked a turning point, a signal that a new force had emerged on the edges of Christendom, a force that would challenge its assumptions, its borders, and its gods. Why Lindisfarne? The answer lies partly in its vulnerability. Isolated and wealthy, it was a tempting target for seaborne raiders, but its spiritual significance gave the attack symbolic weight that no Viking could have foreseen. By striking a holy site, the Norse not only stole treasure, they struck at the heart of European identity. In the years that followed, other raids would follow. Monasteries at Iona, Jarrow, and Wearmouth would be attacked. Rivers would become highways for longships. Towns and villages along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia would be burned, looted, and abandoned. The response was panic, prayer, and a search for answers. Some believed the attacks were divine punishment for sin. Others saw them as the wrath of wild, godless men. Few understood the complex reality behind the raids. That these were not mad barbarians, but disciplined warriors from a culture as rich and layered as their own. Indeed, many of the early raiders were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and fishermen seeking wealth, status, or adventure. But as success followed success, the raids became more organized. Leaders began to emerge, men with ambition, charisma, and the ability to rally warriors around them. And behind the raids, change was stirring in Scandinavia. Chieftains who once ruled over small regions began to consolidate power. The wealth from plunder allowed them to reward followers, build alliances, and challenge rivals. Slowly, the outlines of larger political entities began to form, kingdoms that would one day become Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. But in 793, none of that was visible yet. All that could be seen were the sails on the horizon, the smoke rising from burned churches, and the fear in the hearts of those who thought they were safe. The Viking Age had begun, not with fanfare or conquest, but with an act of violence so shocking it echoed through the centuries. And it was only the beginning. Chapter 5. The Viking Raids and the Expansion of Norse Influence. The raid on Lindisfarne was only the beginning. In the decades that followed, the Viking raids intensified, not as isolated incidents, but as an expanding phenomenon that reached across Europe and beyond. The Norse were no longer content to strike and disappear. They began to explore, to settle, to rule. And in doing so, they reshaped the political and cultural landscapes of entire regions. As the 9th century unfolded, Viking raids became an annual occurrence along the coasts of Britain and Ireland. The longship, the marvel of Norse engineering, was key to this transformation. Its shallow draft allowed it to travel far up rivers, bringing warriors deep into the heart of foreign territories. With a skilled crew, these vessels could travel quickly, almost silently, and land on shores that were unfortified and unprepared. What made the longships truly terrifying was not just their mobility, it was the unpredictability they gave the Vikings. One day they might appear on the Thames, the next they could be sailing up the Seine or looting a coastal monastery in Galicia. There were no fixed front lines, no clear enemies to defend against, only shadows on the water. But what began as raiding soon evolved. The Norse realized that there was more to be gained from staying than from fleeing. Fertile land, strategic locations, and access to trade routes made permanent settlements attractive. And so, in Ireland, towns like Dublin, Limerick, and Cork were born, not as Gaelic cities, but as Viking bases. Dublin in particular became a hub of Viking activity. Founded around 841, it was originally a long fort, a fortified ship encampment. But it quickly grew into a bustling town with markets, blacksmiths, shipbuilders, and trade connections reaching across the Irish Sea and into the wider Norse world. Slaves, silver, spices, and swords changed hands in these growing settlements. In Scotland and the Hebrides, Norse influence grew steadily. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, once marginal outposts, became vital stepping stones for voyages further west. The Vikings did not merely raid these lands, they integrated with them. Gaelic-Norse hybrid cultures emerged, marked by shared language, intermarriage, and mixed traditions. Even place names shifted, bearing traces of Old Norse to this day. Further south, the Franks, descendants of Charlemagne, faced their own Viking crises. Despite strong fortifications and mounted knights, the rivers of Francia became highways for raiders. Paris itself was besieged multiple times, the most famous instance being in 885 to 886, when a large Viking force laid siege to the city for over a year. The Franks, unable to drive the Vikings out by force, often resorted to tribute. Known as danegeld, this was money paid to Viking leaders in exchange for peace. While this strategy bought time, it also enriched and emboldened the Norse. It wasn't long before some began to demand more than silver. They wanted land, and they got it. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple made a historic deal with a Viking leader named Rollo. In exchange for loyalty, baptism into Christianity, and defense against other Viking raiders, Rollo was granted land in what would become known as Normandy, land of the Northmen. From this agreement, a powerful duchy emerged, and the descendants of these Norse settlers would one day produce William the Conqueror, whose invasion of England in 1066 would forever alter European history. This pattern, raid, settle, integrate, was repeated across the Viking world. The Norse were not just warriors, they were adaptable. They could become rulers, farmers, traders, and builders. They absorbed local customs and reshaped them, blending their own traditions with those of the people they encountered. This adaptability allowed the Norse to extend their influence beyond simple violence. Viking craftsmanship became admired across Europe. Norse merchants brought walrus ivory from Greenland, amber from the Baltic, and finely worked jewelry to markets from Ireland to Constantinople. Their swords were prized, their ships envied, and their style imitated. Even their language left its mark. Old Norse words seeped into English, Gaelic, and French. Towns ending in by or thorp often have Viking origins. Legal terms, place names, and personal names reflect the deep integration of Norse culture into the societies they touched. What began as sudden, violent raids soon transformed into a complex and far-reaching network of influence. The Norse did not conquer in the way empires did. They spread like the sea itself, filling every inlet, every river, every unguarded shore. And as the Viking Age deepened, the Norse would go even further, not just west and south, but eastward into the forests and rivers of the Slavic world. There, another chapter of their story would begin. Chapter 6: The Great Heathen Army and the Danelaw in England. By the mid-9th century, the Norse presence in the British Isles had evolved from lightning raids and temporary camps into something far more permanent and far more threatening. No longer content with hit-and-run tactics, a new generation of Vikings aimed to take land, establish rule, and carve out a new future. What began as raiding was becoming conquest. And at the heart of this transformation was a formidable force known as the Great Heathen Army. The term comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which describes a massive Viking force landing in East Anglia in 865. Unlike earlier groups, this was not a collection of loosely allied raiders. It was a coordinated army larger and better organized than anything the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had previously faced. Led by renowned warriors such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, figures who straddle the line between history and legend, the great heathen army moved with purpose and precision. According to tradition, their campaign may have been partly driven by revenge. The legendary Norse hero Ragnar Lothbrok, said to be the father of these leaders, had been executed by King Ella of Northumbria. The invasion, then, was not only strategic, it was deeply personal. But whatever its origins, the great heathen army had a profound impact. Their campaign began in East Anglia, where they accepted tribute and horses from the local king without significant resistance. From there, they struck north into Northumbria, one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In 867, they captured the city of York, then called Eoforwic, a major economic and religious centre. King Ella and King Osbert, former rivals, joined forces to try and retake the city, but both were defeated and killed. Northumbria was now under Viking control. Next, the army turned southward, targeting the kingdom of Mercia. Although they did not conquer it outright, they secured tribute and installed puppet rulers, effectively neutralizing the region. In 870, the Vikings returned to East Anglia. This time, they demanded more than horses. King Edmund resisted and was executed. He would later be venerated as Saint Edmund, a symbol of Christian martyrdom against the heathen threat. By now, it was clear the Vikings were no longer passing through. They were here to stay. To manage the lands they seized, the Norse began to establish settlements and structures of governance. This marked the birth of what became known as the Danelaw, an expansive region in eastern and northern England under Viking control, named for the Danes who ruled it. The Danelaw was not a formal kingdom, but a patchwork of territories governed by Norse laws, customs, and leaders. Towns like York, Lincoln, and Leicester flourished under Viking rule. Norse settlers brought their language, their farming techniques, and their legal traditions, which included trial by jury, communal assemblies, and detailed compensation for crimes. But the conquest was not uncontested. To the southwest, the kingdom of Wessex stood firm. Under the leadership of King Ethelred, and later his younger brother Alfred, Wessex resisted the Viking advance with determination and resilience. In 871, Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great, faced the Viking army in a series of battles. Though the war seesawed between victory and defeat, Alfred managed to hold his ground. In 878, following a surprise Viking attack during the winter, Alfred regrouped, rallied his forces, and achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Edington. The Viking leader Guthrum was forced to negotiate. He accepted baptism and agreed to withdraw to East Anglia. This treaty, known as the Treaty of Wedmore, formally recognized the division between Wessex and the Danelaw. It was a turning point. For the first time, a lasting peace had been negotiated between a Christian English king and a pagan Norse ruler. The Vikings, once outsiders, were now landholders and rulers within England. They had established a parallel society, one that blended Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions. In the Danelaw, old gods still lingered, but Christian churches were rebuilt. Norse warriors farmed the land, traded in markets, and raised families. The line between settler and native began to blur. Culturally, this period was rich and dynamic. Norse place names took root, especially in areas of dense settlement. Towns ending in "by", meaning farm or village, such as Derby and Grimsby, are Viking legacies. Old Norse words entered the English language, words like sky, knife, window, and husband. But the Danelaw was not static. Over time, it would be challenged and reclaimed by English kings. Yet its legacy endured, not only in language and law, but in the idea that the Vikings were more than raiders. They were builders, rulers, and shapers of history. The story of the great heathen army is not just one of conquest. It is a story of transformation, of how the Norse became part of the very lands they once sought to plunder. And as they dug roots into England, their ambitions continued to stretch outward to Ireland, to Francia, and beyond. Chapter 7. Vikings in Ireland, Scotland, and the Isles. Settlers and swordsmen. As the Viking footprint deepened in England, their ambitions continued westward, carried by the winds across the Irish Sea and up into the rugged northern reaches of the British Isles. Here, among emerald hills, misty isles, and storm-tossed coasts, the Norse encountered new peoples, new opportunities, and new challenges. Ireland, in particular, became a focal point of Viking activity and one of the most complex chapters of their story. The first recorded Viking raid on Ireland occurred in 795, when Norse ships attacked a monastery on Lambay Island, near Dublin. The pattern was familiar. Monasteries were wealth-rich and poorly defended. Over the next few decades, these hit-and-run assaults became a grim seasonal expectation along the Irish coast. Armagh, Kells, Glendalough, and other monastic centres suffered the same fate as Lindisfarne before them. Yet by the mid-9th century, something changed. Rather than returning home after each raid, the Norse began to winter in Ireland. They established fortified camps known as long forts, precursors to permanent settlements. The most significant of these was founded along the River Liffey. It would become Dublin. From its beginnings, around 841, Dublin grew rapidly. It became not only a military base, but a vibrant economic centre. Its sheltered harbour allowed for trade across the Irish Sea, into the North Atlantic and beyond. Norse merchants exchanged furs, slaves, weapons, and silver. Local Irish kings soon found themselves engaging not only in war with the Norse, but in alliances, marriages, and rivalries. Indeed, the relationship between Vikings and native Irish was not black and white. While early chronicles emphasized the brutality of the Norse, the reality was far more nuanced. Over time, Norse and Irish intermarried, shared languages, and even fought alongside each other in complex local power struggles. The term Hiberno-Norse emerged to describe this mixed culture, one that blended Norse customs with Gaelic traditions. Dublin wasn't the only Norse town. Settlements emerged in Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. These towns became nodes in a growing Norse trade network, connecting Scandinavia with the British Isles, continental Europe, and even the Islamic world through distant intermediaries. But while the Irish coast offered trade and wealth, the Norse were also drawn north, to Scotland and the Isles. The geography of this region, scattered islands, narrow straits, and deep lochs, was ideal for Norse seafarers. By the early 9th century, they had taken control of the Shetland and Orkney Islands. These wind-swept archipelagos became launch points for further voyages and raids. The Norse presence here was so strong that the islands remained under Scandinavian control for centuries. From Orkney, the Vikings moved into the Hebrides and parts of the western Scottish mainland. Like in Ireland, their role was multifaceted, sometimes raiders, sometimes settlers, and often rulers. They established new communities, farmed the land, and used the sea as their highway between worlds. In many parts of Scotland, Norse influence became deeply entrenched. Place names such as Stornoway, Ullapool, and Kirkwall bear the mark of Old Norse. Archaeological finds reveal Norse-style burials, tools, and even religious items, suggesting both continuity and adaptation. Further south, in the Isle of Man, a unique Norse Gaelic culture emerged. The island, perfectly situated between Ireland, Scotland, and England, became a key hub of Norse activity. It developed its own Norse-style parliament, the Tynwald, which still exists today as one of the oldest continuous parliamentary bodies in the world. Throughout this expansion, Viking warfare remained a constant threat. Norse war bands continued to strike inland, battling local rulers and each other. But just as often, they played politics, forming alliances, betraying partners, and installing puppet kings. The Norse were not outsiders for long. They became part of the intricate web of local power, especially in Ireland. In some regions, Norse rulers even converted to Christianity, adopting aspects of local culture while retaining their own identity. By the turn of the 10th century, the Vikings were no longer invaders. They were landowners, lords, and, in some cases, kings. Norse names appeared in Irish annals not as enemies, but as actors on the stage of Gaelic politics. This blending of cultures produced a rich, if turbulent, legacy. In the art, language, and folklore of Ireland and Scotland, echoes of the Norse remain. The sagas would tell of heroes who fought across these lands, of lost treasures, and of battles where the line between friend and foe was never clear. The Norse brought their ships, their swords, and their gods, but they also brought change. And in these isles of stone and sea, they found not only conquest, but a new home. Chapter 8: The Norse in Francia and the Formation of Normandy. While the British Isles bore the brunt of early Viking expansion, the Norse gaze did not stop there. To the south, across the English Channel, lay Francia, an empire built on the ruins of Rome, ruled by kings who claimed the mantle of Charlemagne. Rich in cities, abbeys, and trade routes, Francia was both a tempting target and a land of opportunity. The first recorded Viking raid on Frankish territory occurred in 799, near the mouth of the Seine. It was followed by a series of increasingly bold incursions. By the 840s, Viking longships were a common sight along the coasts of modern-day France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Seine, Loire, and Garonne rivers became thoroughfares for Norse raiders who sailed deep into the heart of Frankish lands, plundering towns and extorting payments. The Frankish response was mixed. In some cases, local rulers organized defenses and repelled attacks. In others, they paid danegeld, silver given to the Vikings in hopes of buying peace. But the payments often only encouraged more raids. To the Norse, Francia was a treasure trove, filled with monasteries heavy with gold and cities light on defenses. The city of Paris became a particular focus. In 845, a large Viking fleet sailed up the Seine under the command of a chieftain named Ragnar, possibly the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, though the sources are unclear. They attacked and sacked Paris, causing panic across the region. King Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, paid a massive tribute to secure their departure. This raid was not an anomaly. Paris would be attacked again and again in the decades that followed. The most famous siege came in 885 to 886, when a Viking army, possibly numbering thousands, besieged the city for nearly a year. The defenders, led by Count Odo, held firm. The siege ended not with a decisive battle, but with negotiation. Emperor Charles the Fat allowed the Vikings to sail further upriver and raid Burgundy instead. It became clear that Francia, despite its wealth, was vulnerable. But out of this chaos came a remarkable transformation. In 911, a pivotal event occurred. A powerful Viking leader named Rollo led his warriors into northern Francia. Rather than continue endless war, King Charles the Simple offered Rollo a deal: land in exchange for loyalty. Rollo would receive the territory around the Lower Seine, what would become known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In return, Rollo would convert to Christianity, marry into Frankish nobility, and defend the kingdom from other Viking raiders. Rollo accepted. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte marked the beginning of a new era. This agreement was more than a peace treaty. It was the foundation of a Norse-Frankish fusion that would reshape European history. The Vikings who settled in Normandy adopted the local language, intermarried with the Frankish population, and gradually transformed into a new identity, the Normans. But they did not forget their roots. Norman society retained elements of Norse culture, its martial spirit, its naval skill, and its sense of independence. Their dukes ruled with strength, and their territory grew rich and powerful. Norman warriors became known across Europe for their prowess, fighting in Italy, Sicily, and the Holy Land. And in 1066, the greatest legacy of this transformation would come to pass. William, Duke of Normandy, descended from Rollo himself, would cross the English Channel and claim the throne of England after the Battle of Hastings. The conqueror of England was not a Frank, nor a Dane, but a blend of both. A true child of the Viking Age, the creation of Normandy stands as one of the most successful examples of Viking assimilation. What began as raiding ended in rulership. The Norse, once feared as destroyers, had become defenders of a realm they helped shape. This chapter of Viking history reminds us that their legacy was not simply destruction, it was reinvention. The Vikings could adapt, absorb, and thrive. They were not bound by the borders of language or creed. Where opportunity called, they followed. From the icy fjords of Norway to the green fields of northern France, the Norse journey was not just across miles, but across identities. And as they settled in the west, another group of Vikings was sailing east into rivers that led to a very different destiny. Chapter 9. The Eastern Vikings. The Rus, Byzantium, and the steppe. While many Vikings turned westward, raiding and settling in the British Isles and Francia, another branch of Norse adventurers looked east. These were primarily Swedes, explorers, traders, and warriors, who ventured into the vast river networks of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. Their story is less known to the Western world, but no less remarkable. These Vikings came to be known as the Varangians, and their journey was defined not by coastal raids, but by deep inland navigation. The Baltic Sea opened to the Gulf of Finland, and from there, A network of rivers, the Neva, the Volkhov, the Dnieper, and the Volga, led into the heart of the Slavic and Finno-Ugric lands. These rivers, though perilous and interrupted by rapids and portages, became highways for Norse expansion. The Varangians were traders as much as warriors. Their longships carried goods from the north, furs, walrus ivory, honey, and slaves, and returned laden with silver, silks, and spices from the east. Along these routes, they established outposts, trading posts, and eventually fortified settlements. One such settlement was Novgorod, which would become one of the most important cities in Russian history. Another was Kiev, located along the Dnieper River. By the late 9th century, Kiev had become a powerful center of Varangian control. From there, the Norse, now increasingly known as the Rus, established a polity that would eventually evolve into the Kievan Rus, the precursor to modern Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The name Rus likely derives from an Old Norse word, possibly rods, meaning rowers or those who row. It is a name that would give rise to the very term Russia. According to the primary chronicle, a medieval Slavic text, the Slavic tribes invited a Varangian prince named Rurik to rule over them, seeking order amid internal conflict. Rurik accepted and established himself at Novgorod around 862. His successors expanded southward, capturing Kiev and uniting the region. Whether this account is myth or truth, it reflects a key theme. The Norse did not simply impose rule. They often filled power vacuums, offering protection and organization in exchange for loyalty and tribute. As rulers of the Kievan Rus, the Norse elite intermingled with local Slavic populations, gradually adopting their language, customs, and religion. Yet traces of their Scandinavian roots remained in names, legal traditions, and the stories passed down through generations. The Rus also cast their eyes further south. The Dnieper River led to the Black Sea, and beyond it lay the richest city in the medieval world, Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. Known to the Norse as Miklagard, the great city, Constantinople was a place of immense wealth and splendor, its domes and walls shimmering in the sun, its markets filled with goods from across 3 continents. The Rus established trade relations with Byzantium, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through war. Treaties were signed, embassies exchanged, and markets opened to Norse merchants. They brought furs, wax, and slaves, and returned with silk, wine, and gold. In time, many Norsemen entered the service of the Byzantine emperors. These men, fierce and loyal, formed the core of the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of bodyguards that protected the emperor himself. Clad in mail and wielding mighty axes, the Varangians became legendary for their bravery and discipline. Their presence is recorded not only in chronicles, but in the very stones of Byzantium. Runic inscriptions, carved by Norsemen, have been found in the Hagia Sophia, silent echoes of their presence in the heart of an empire far from home. Back in the north, the Kievan Rus grew into a sophisticated state. It developed a legal code, maintained diplomatic ties with Europe and the Middle East, and served as a cultural bridge between the Latin West and the Orthodox East. Christianity arrived in the 10th century, and with it, the gradual fading of Norse pagan traditions. But the Norse legacy endured. It was etched into the foundations of cities, embedded in the stories of kings, and remembered in the names of rivers and rulers. The eastward expansion of the Vikings was not marked by dramatic battles or sweeping conquests. It was a story of commerce, integration, and transformation. These Vikings did not vanish. They became part of something larger. From the icy shores of the Baltic to the golden domes of Constantinople, the Varangians mapped a world of possibilities. They carried not only axes and ambition, but ideas, technologies, and faiths. And in doing so, they helped shape the course of Eastern European history. As the Rus grew into a state of their own, the Viking identity began to fade into memory. But their influence remained, a quiet, powerful current flowing beneath the surface of empire and myth. And even as the Norse integrated into new lands, their hunger for discovery pressed ever onward, toward the edge of the known world. Chapter 10. Westward Bound, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. While many Vikings journeyed east into the rivers of Russia and south into the heart of Europe, another stream of Norse expansion flowed in a different direction, westward into the open Atlantic. Here, in the cold, mist-wrapped waters, the Norse became more than raiders and traders. They became explorers. Their destinations were distant, rugged, and mysterious. Lands that would stretch the limits of their knowledge, test their endurance, and expand the known world. The first step westward was the discovery and settlement of the Faroe Islands, a group of windswept isles halfway between Norway and Iceland. These islands, though small, offered shelter and pastures for sheep, and they served as an important way station in the Norse Atlantic network. But the real leap came with Iceland. The first known Norse sighting of Iceland occurred around the late 9th century, though it may have been known to Irish monks even earlier. A Norwegian chieftain named Nadod is often credited as the first Norseman to set foot on the island, followed by others such as Garda Svavason and Floki Vilgadason, whose name, Raven Floki, lives on in saga and legend. Floki's journey was marked by hardship. According to tradition, he brought ravens with him, releasing them to find land as he sailed. When he finally arrived, he encountered harsh weather and a bleak, frozen landscape. He called it Iceland. Despite his disappointment, others would soon follow. By the 870s, a steady stream of settlers began to arrive, many of them fleeing the growing power of Norwegian kings. These settlers brought with them livestock, tools, slaves, and the memory of their homeland. They also brought a spirit of independence and a willingness to endure. Iceland's environment was harsh but survivable. Its volcanic soil could support crops and grazing, while the surrounding seas offered rich fishing grounds. Timber was scarce, but turf and stone provided building materials. By 930, the settlers had formed a unique political system, the Althing. Held at Thingvellir, this annual assembly gathered chieftains and freemen from across the island to make laws, settle disputes, and uphold justice. It was one of the earliest forms of representative government in Europe, and a testament to the Norse tradition of communal decision-making. Unlike other Viking settlements, Iceland was not conquered by force. It was built from scratch, a society of equals in a stark land, united by culture and law. But the Norse did not stop there. To the northwest, lay another land, glimpsed only through rumor and chance: Greenland. Around the year 982, a fiery and ambitious chieftain named Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for committing murder. Rather than accept defeat, he sailed further west, following stories of a distant coast. What he found was a land of deep fjords, ice-bound shores, and seasonal beauty. He named it Greenland, perhaps as a cunning piece of marketing to attract settlers. When his exile ended, he returned to Iceland and convinced others to follow him. Around 985, a fleet of ships set sail, and 2 Norse settlements were established on Greenland's southern coast. These settlements, known as the Eastern and Western settlements, were isolated but surprisingly successful. For several centuries, they maintained farms, churches, and trade with Iceland and Norway. They raised cattle and sheep, hunted seals, and even built a cathedral at Garda. Life in Greenland was never easy. The climate was severe, and the land only marginally arable. But the Norse endured, at least for a time. And then came the most legendary voyage of all: Vinland. According to the Icelandic sagas, the Norse explorer Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000. He followed stories of a sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had sighted unknown lands beyond the sea. Leif landed in a place he called Vinland, described as lush, forested, and rich with resources. The exact location of Vinland remains debated. The most likely site is Lands o' Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, where Norse-style buildings and artifacts have been discovered. This site proves that Norse explorers reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. In Vinland, the Norse found grapes, timber, and game, but they also encountered resistance, likely from the native peoples of the region, whom the sagas call Skraelings. Relations were tense and eventually hostile. The Norse, unable to maintain a permanent settlement, returned to Greenland. Still, the journey to Vinland remains one of the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age. It represents the farthest western reach of Norse exploration and the first known contact between Europeans and the Americas. These western voyages were not just about discovery. They were about survival, ambition, and curiosity. They showed the Norse capacity to adapt to new environments, to govern themselves in isolation, and to seek new beginnings. Even as their world changed, through Christianization, centralization, and fading myths, the spirit of exploration remained, and in the longhouses of Iceland and Greenland, stories of distant lands continued to echo. Chapter 11. Life in the Viking homelands, daily routines and domestic life. Amid tales of daring voyages, heroic battles, and legendary discoveries, it's easy to forget that the vast majority of Viking life was lived not on stormy seas or foreign shores, but at home, among fields, fjords, and forests. The Viking homelands, in what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, were the heart of Norse civilization. And within them, daily life followed a rhythm shaped by the seasons, the land, and the bonds of community. Most Norse people were not warriors or explorers. They were farmers, craftsmen, fishers, and traders. They lived in small, tightly knit communities that dotted the landscape, each centered around a family or a group of allied families. Life was rooted in the land and in the longhouse. The longhouse was the nucleus of Norse domestic life. These elongated wooden buildings were typically built with thick walls of timber or turf, topped with thatched or sod-covered roofs. A central hearth provided warmth and light, its smoke drifting up through a hole in the roof. The longhouse was a place of shelter, of work, of storytelling, and of shared meals. Inside, life was communal. Multiple generations lived under one roof, along with servants and, in many cases, thralls, enslaved people who worked the land and served the household. Privacy was scarce, but cooperation was essential. Tasks were divided by gender and age, with everyone contributing to the household's survival. Men typically handled farming, hunting, fishing, and construction. They tended livestock, sowed fields of barley and oats, and fished the nearby seas and rivers. They built and repaired tools, fences, and boats, and hunted game, such as elk and deer, when the opportunity arose. Women managed the household, which was no small feat. They prepared food, spun wool, wove textiles, and cared for children. They churned butter, brewed ale, and maintained supplies for the long winters. In wealthier households, women often oversaw the work of others and held authority in the absence of their husbands. Importantly, Norse women had rights that were notable for the time. They could own property, inherit wealth, and initiate divorce. Some even ran farms or businesses. The image of the passive medieval woman does not apply well to Viking society. Norse women were vital to both the economy and the community. Children began helping with chores at an early age. Boys might join their fathers in the fields or on fishing trips, while girls learned the intricacies of spinning, weaving, and household care. Education was informal, but deeply embedded in everyday life. Children learned by watching, imitating, and participating. Seasons dictated the pace of life. Spring and summer were times of intense labor, planting, fishing, building, and trading. Markets opened, ships set sail, and communities bustled with activity. Autumn was a time of harvest, slaughtering livestock for winter and preserving food. Winter, long and dark, brought a slower rhythm. People stayed indoors, told stories, mended tools, and wove cloth. It was a time of closeness, of family, and of reflection. Religion and ritual were woven into daily life. Sacrifices were made to the gods for a good harvest or a safe voyage. Sacred groves, stones, and springs were places of quiet reverence. Seasonal festivals such as Yule marked the passing of time, blending feasting with spiritual observance. The Norse were deeply connected to their environment. They read the weather, understood the movements of stars and tides, and knew how to work with the land rather than against it. This intimacy with nature bred both humility and pride. Life was hard, but it was theirs, shaped by their hands, guided by their gods. Even amid the hardships, there was beauty. Norse communities valued art, poetry, and craftsmanship. Carved wood, intricate metalwork, dyed textiles, and handcrafted tools filled their homes. Skalds recited epic poems around the fire, preserving history and myth through the spoken word. Food was simple but nourishing. Barley bread, porridge, smoked fish, stews made from root vegetables and meat, and ale brewed from grain and herbs. Where available, honey-sweetened dishes, or made mead for special occasions. Diets vary depending on region. Coastal communities relied more on fish and seaweed, while inland areas depended more on farming and livestock. Despite their reputation for brutality abroad, Norse communities were built on cooperation and order. Disputes were handled through local assemblies, or things, where free men could speak and vote. Compensation for crimes, known as wergild, was preferred over blood feuds, though vengeance still played a role when justice failed. In the homelands, the Viking Age was less about conquest and more about continuity. These were people who loved their homes, their kin, and their traditions. Their exploration and expansion did not grow out of boredom or chaos, but from a stable society seeking opportunity. And as the Norse world expanded across seas and continents, it was this foundation, the longhouse, the hearth, the family, that anchored them. At home or abroad, they carried their culture with them. Chapter 12: Viking Religion, Myths, and the Norse Cosmos. Long before the cross replaced the hammer and the stone church supplanted the sacred grove, the Norse world was shaped by a belief system as vast and intricate as the stars above and the roots beneath their feet. Viking religion was not codified in scriptures or constrained by a single doctrine. It was a living, breathing mythology, woven into the rhythms of nature, the memory of ancestors, and the courage of the human spirit. To the Norse, the world was not a single, flat realm. It was a complex cosmos known as the Nine Worlds, each connected by a mighty ash tree, Yggdrasil, the World Tree. Its roots reached deep into the underworld, and its branches stretched across the heavens. Yggdrasil was not only a symbol of life, but the very structure of existence, uniting gods, men, and monsters. At the top of this cosmic hierarchy was Asgard, the home of the Aesir gods, powerful beings who governed war, wisdom, fate, and the elements. Chief among them was Odin, the All-Father, god of war, poetry, and knowledge. With one eye sacrificed for wisdom, Odin rode his 8-legged horse Sleipnir across the skies, guided by ravens Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. Beside him stood Thor, god of thunder, the protector of mankind. Armed with his hammer, Mjolnir, and a temper as explosive as a summer storm, Thor fought the giants who threatened cosmic order. He was revered not only for his might, but for his loyalty and courage. Freyja, the goddess of love, beauty, and war, ruled the realm of Folkvanga, where half of the heroic dead were said to dwell. Her twin brother, Freyja, was a god of fertility, peace, and prosperity, worshipped by farmers and seafarers alike. Loki, the trickster god, added chaos to the divine order. Neither fully evil nor entirely good, Loki's mischief often set events in motion that would challenge the gods and alter destinies. He was a reminder that the universe, like life, could not be controlled. The Norse gods were not perfect. They were flawed, passionate, and mortal in their own way. They loved, they lied, they failed. But in their stories, the Norse found reflections of themselves, struggles against fate, defiance in the face of doom, and a deep appreciation for honor, family, and legacy. Beneath Asgard lay Midgard, the world of humans. It was connected to the gods by Bifrost, the shimmering rainbow bridge. Midgard was protected by the gods, but also vulnerable, surrounded by threats from Jotunheim, the land of the giants, and other perilous realms. Niflheim, the world of ice and mist, was home to Hel, the goddess of the dead. Unlike the Christian heaven and hell, Norse afterlife was not strictly moralistic. Warriors who died gloriously in battle were taken to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they prepared for the final battle of Ragnarok. But others, who died of age or illness, might go to Hel's domain, not a place of punishment, but of quiet, shadowed rest. The idea of Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, was central to Norse cosmology. It foretold the end of the world in fire and chaos. At Ragnarok, the gods would face their ultimate enemies. Odin would fall to the wolf Fenrir. Thor would slay and be slain by the serpent Jormungandr. The sun and moon would be devoured. The seas would rise, the skies burn. And yet, from this destruction, a new world would be born. Green and fertile, cleansed of the old, it would rise from the sea. Survivors would repopulate the earth. In this, the Norse found hope. That even in the darkest end, renewal was possible. Rituals and sacrifices were part of Norse religious life. Offerings of food, animals, and sometimes humans were made to the gods, especially during festivals like Yule and Blot ceremonies. Sacred places included groves, stones, springs, and burial mounds, places where the veil between worlds felt thin. Priests, known as Gothar, led ceremonies, but Norse religion lacked a rigid hierarchy. Faith was personal and communal, practical and mystical. Amulets bearing Thor's hammer were worn for protection. Runes, carved into wood and stone, were used for divination and magic. The oral tradition kept the myths alive. Skalds and storytellers passed down tales of Odin's sacrifice on Yggdrasil, of Thor's journeys to Jotunheim, of Loki's tricks, and the binding of Fenrir. These stories were more than entertainment, they were maps of meaning, anchoring the Norse in a world that could be cruel and chaotic. With the coming of Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries, the old gods began to fade. Temples were replaced with churches. Myths were written down by Christian scribes, preserving them even as belief waned. But in remote valleys and quiet households, the old ways lingered for generations. Today, the Norse myths still captivate the imagination. They echo in literature, film, and fantasy. But for the Vikings, these stories were not fiction. They were truth, shaped in the form of metaphor and legend, guiding their understanding of life, death, and the cosmos. In their myths, the Vikings found courage to face the unknown, reverence for nature, and an unshakable belief in the value of honor and destiny. Chapter 13: The Viking Age in Popular Culture and Modern Imagination. As the final sails of the Viking Age faded into the mist of history, their legacy remained, resting quietly in the bones of longships buried beneath turf, in the names of towns and rivers, and in the whispers of old sagas recited by candlelight. But in the centuries that followed, the image of the Viking did not vanish. It evolved. It reawakened in the minds of poets, scholars, and storytellers. And in modern times, it has become something larger than history, an icon, a symbol, a myth reborn. The Viking revival began in the 18th and 19th centuries. when antiquarians and romantic poets rediscovered the Old Norse sagas. These texts, rich in drama, heroism, and tragedy, captured imaginations across Europe. Writers such as William Blake and Sir Walter Scott helped ignite a fascination with the fierce freedom and fatalism of the Norse world. Scholars began to translate the Eddas and sagas, bringing tales of Odin, Thor, and Ragnar into public consciousness. By the Victorian era, the Viking had become a complex figure, part barbarian, part noble, savage. In Scandinavia, the rediscovery of Viking heritage became a source of national pride. Museums were built, burial mounds excavated, and ancient artifacts displayed as emblems of cultural identity. The longship, with its dragon prow and sea-carved grace, became a symbol of courage and exploration. But with popularization came distortion. In early 20th century imagery, Vikings were often depicted with horned helmets, an invention of costume designers, not archaeologists. These romanticized warriors became staples of operas, comic books, and children's stories. The complex reality of Norse life was reduced to battle cries, drinking horns, and exaggerated masculinity. Still, the Viking archetype proved enduring. In modern times, they have found new life in film, television, and gaming. Movies like The 13th Warrior, Thor, and How to Train Your Dragon drew heavily from Norse mythology and aesthetics. Television series, such as Vikings and The Last Kingdom, brought gritty interpretations of Viking life to global audiences, blending historical drama with cinematic flair. While these portrayals often take liberties, they have also sparked interest in Viking culture, leading many to seek out the true history behind the spectacle. In the realm of video games, titles like Assassin's Creed, Valhalla, God of War, and Hellblade explore Norse mythology and Viking themes with varying degrees of accuracy and creativity. These interactive experiences invite players into imagined versions of Norse worlds, blending myth and history in compelling ways. Yet beyond entertainment, the Viking legacy also inspires more grounded exploration. Living history groups recreate Viking clothing, tools, and battles with scholarly attention to detail. Archaeological discoveries, like the Oseberg ship, the Jelling stones, and the remains of a Norse woman buried with weapons, continue to reshape our understanding. Museums across Scandinavia and beyond offer immersive exhibits, while DNA studies trace the genetic footprints of Norse settlers across Europe. The Vikings also resonate deeply in spiritual and philosophical movements. Modern practitioners of Asatru, a revival of Norse paganism, find meaning in the old gods and rituals. Others draw inspiration from Viking virtues, courage, loyalty, endurance, in crafting personal codes of conduct. Yet there is a darker side to this legacy. In recent decades, extremist groups have attempted to co-opt Viking symbols for their own ideologies, distorting ancient myths to fit modern hatred. Scholars, museums, and communities have responded forcefully, reclaiming these symbols and emphasizing the true diversity and complexity of Norse culture. The Vikings were not a monolith. They were traders and poets, craftsmen and explorers. Their stories are not just about war, but about migration, adaptation, and the human spirit. In the end, the fascination with Vikings endures because their world was one of contrasts. Fierce yet familial, pagan yet poetic, brutal yet visionary. Today, as you fall asleep to the story of the Viking Age, imagine not just the clang of swords or the howl of winter wind, but the quiet moments too. A family sharing bread beneath a sod roof, a skald reciting a saga by firelight, a ship setting out into the unknown, guided by stars and hope. The Vikings are gone, but their echoes remain in language, in legend, and in the human longing to explore, to understand, and to remember.